Okay. Well, let's get started. The Canadian Index for Measuring Integration and Inclusion. It started off as the Canadian Index for Measuring Integration. We've since expanded to inclusion, and we're going to have a little discussion about what that means and what that looks like from a methodological standpoint, how we measure integration versus inclusion. But first, we're just going to give you a bit of an overview of the tool itself, some of the directions we're taking with it, and we're always looking for feedback from our audiences, and you, of course. The settlement sector is our main audience, as well as policymakers, researchers, and academics across Canada and beyond, actually. And so let's get started here. Okay. So this, just to give you an outline of the session, we're going to talk about obviously the overview of the CIMII, discuss the utility of the CIMII for specific audiences, like I mentioned, settlement service providers, researchers, policymakers, the general public. We also want to demonstrate how to access the online CIMII tool to identify immigrants' integration. And we also have integration gaps or outcomes, you might say. We also have a new product, which my colleague Ravindra has been working on for a while now. It's a city profile. So in other words, we're trying to take all the data that we have in the CIMII and the website, because there's a lot of data in there once you explore it. And we're creating profiles for each city across Canada. And we started with Calgary, since a lot of the attendees here today are from Calgary, work in the settlement sector there. And we also want to discuss new research avenues, such as expanding the CIMII to the north. Currently, the CIMII is it only covers the southern Canada, so the 10 provinces and some 41 CMAs, census metropolitan areas. New areas also are looking at integration of Francophonie immigrants across Canada. So you can think about Anglophone immigrants within Quebec, and then outside of Quebec, Francophonie immigrants. And also looking at, I mentioned that we look currently at the city level or the provincial level, looking at lower levels of geography. So what about within the city itself? How can we analyze CIMII outcomes there? And then also looking at cross-national comparisons. Our CIMII tool has been adopted by others in South America. Paris is currently working on a iteration of the CIMII for their populations. And so just to give you a demonstration of how others are using or potentially could be used. On that note, let me pass this over to my colleague Michele, and he's going to give you a little bit overview of the CIMII itself.
Yes, good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for being here again. My name is Michele Vitale, and I am a research analyst at the Association for Canadian Studies, and I mostly work on the CIMII. Okay, so I'm going to give you a background of the CIMII. So the main objective of the CIMII is basically evaluating, assessing the level of immigrant integration in Canada. By immigrants, we basically consider immigrants between 18 and 64 years of age. The CIMII assesses the level of integration of immigrants compared to Canadian-borns. But also the CIMII compares established immigrants with recent immigrants. Okay, established immigrants are those ones who arrived in Canada 5 years ago or more, and recent immigrants are those who arrived in Canada less than 5 years ago. Because of data availability, non-permanent residents are not included in the index. So you'll see that the CIMII assesses immigrant integration, when it comes to 4 key dimensions. The economic dimension, which is the most important dimension for the index, the social dimension, the civic and demographic participation dimension, and the health dimension. So the level of integration for immigrants is evaluated for all 10 Canadian provinces, but also at the CMA level. So far, we are considering 41 census metropolitan areas in Canada. And until now, we have collected data from 1991 to 2021, and we keep updating our data sets. When it comes to data sources, we mostly use Statistic Canada data sets. The most important data source is probably the Canadian census. That's for sure the most important data source when it comes to economic dimension. And so far, we collected data from the 1991 census until the 2021. If you go to our website, and my colleague Ravi will show you probably that, you'll see that we just have a new dashboard with the most recent economic data and rankings for the economic dimension. Then for the social and civic and demographic participation dimension, the most important data source is a general social survey. Okay, we have collected data from 23 to 2020. And then finally, for the health dimension, the data source, the main data source is the Canadian Community Health Survey. And again, in this case, we collected data from 2000 to 2020. Yeah, you can move on, Paul. Okay, so these are the dimensions and indicators of the index of the CIMII. Okay, as I mentioned before, we have 4 dimensions: the economic dimension, the social dimension, civic and democratic participation, and the health dimension. Overall, we have 22 indicators. So the economic dimension, which again is the most important dimension, has 8 indicators: wages, low income, labor force participation, employment and unemployment rate, full-time employment rate, subsidized housing, and non-official language at work. So in other words, whether immigrants speak a non-official language in their workplace. For the social dimension, we have 6 indicators: number of close friends in the same community, sense of belonging to local community, to the province, and to Canada, and whether immigrants have been victim of discrimination in the past 5 years. For the civic dimension, we have volunteer work, involvement in organizations, and actually if immigrants have voted in the last provincial or federal election. And then finally, for the health dimension, we have 4 indicators until now: having a regular medical doctor, self-perceived life stress, satisfaction with life, and self-perceived unmet healthcare needs. Now, we are also always trying to find, to incorporate new indicators. For instance, now we are considering incorporating a core housing need, or underemployment, overqualification, occupational skill levels as potential, additional indicators that could be incorporated in the index. Okay, something very important about the CIMII is that the index provides rankings at the provincial and CMA level for all 4 dimensions and for all the 22 indicators. And so the most important concept to understand when it comes to the rankings of the index is that these rankings are based on the gap in integration outcomes between immigrants and the Canadian-born population. But we also have rankings for all dimensions and for all indicators when it comes to the integration gaps, the gaps in outcomes, when it comes to the gaps between established immigrants and recent immigrants. So the concept, the overall idea is that the smaller the gap in outcomes, so the smaller the gap between, for instance, immigrants and the Canadian-born population, the better the ranking of the region, which can be either a province or a CMA, compared to the rest of Canada. And so each ranking comes from a regional score. So we have scores, and these regional scores are calculated, determined by a statistical regression model. So these regression models, for instance, they include linear regression models for outcomes like continuous variables, like for instance wages, but we also have logistic regression models for outcomes that are binary, like for instance having voted in the last federal election or not. Another important thing is that these regression models of the CIMII include control variables. So just to make sure that the groups compared, like for instance, immigrants and Canadian-borns, share the same similar characteristics. Yeah. Oh, these are 2 screenshots from the current website. My colleague Ravi is going to show you the website in much more detail. But just to give you an idea, so for instance, on the left side, we have unemployment rate. So these are the rankings at the provincial level for this specific indicator. As you can see, the users of the website can select the groups to compare. In this case, we are comparing immigrants versus non-immigrants versus Canadian-borns. But again, the users can also decide to compare recent versus established immigrants. And then there is also the possibility to select a specific period of time. So the rankings for when it comes to the provinces, Canadian provinces, the ranks go from 1 to 10. As you can see from, in this case, the provinces on the Atlantic, in Atlantic Canada, have the best rankings, like Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. But then, besides the rankings for each specific indicator, we also have rankings for each dimension. In this case, we are visualizing the rankings at the provincial level for the economic dimension, so the overall economic dimension. So something important to remember is that in this case, the rankings are based on the simple average of all the indicators belonging to this dimension. In this case, we have 8 indicators. And again, you can see from this screenshot that Newfoundland and Labrador, and in this case, I believe Saskatchewan, have the better rankings in Canada when it comes to the overall economic dimension. Okay, so we have rankings at the indicator level, we have rankings at the dimension level, but we also have overall rankings. And so the idea of the overall rankings is basically to evaluate the overall performance of Canadian provinces and Canadian CMAs. And so the difference between the overall rankings and the dimension rankings is that the overall rankings are based on a weighting system. Okay, so basically the CIMII index weights the 4 dimensions. And so, as I mentioned before, the economic dimension is the most important dimension when it comes to integration. So the weight for the economic dimension is 40%. Then the second one is the social dimension, whose weight is 30%. 20% for the civic and democratic dimension, and finally the weight for the health dimension is 10%. Now, can you go back 1 second? One interesting thing about, so this is actually the let's say the original weights that we assign to these 4 different dimensions. But actually, if you go on the website, and again, I think my colleague Ravi will show you that users have also the possibility to change the weights. So you can adjust the weights based on your interests, and you'll see how the rankings at the provincial level change based on the weights that you assign to those 4 different dimensions. So actually, we always say that what really makes the CIMII different from maybe the other indices that are out there is that we use controls. We use controls in our statistical models. So the CIMII always starts with descriptive data. So in descriptive data, in this case, like for instance, wages. So descriptive data are useful just to give us an idea, a snapshot, I would say, of the differences between, in this case, the wages of immigrants and Canadian-borns. We can say the same thing between recent and established immigrants. But actually, our rankings and what makes the CIMII different from other indices is that our rankings are not based on descriptive data, but are based on on regression models, which means that we take in consideration, we evaluate those differences, in this case in wages, when controlling for many other social demographic factors. Yeah, you can go. And so these are actually the controls that we use in for our regression models. It's mostly socio-demographic controls, so sex, age, visible minority, language, education level, occupation, full-time employment. We also have some controls that are used only for specific dimensions, like for instance, self-perceived physical health and self-perceived mental health. There are controls that are used only in the statistical models for the health indicators, or mobility, having moved in the last 5 years, is a control variable that we use only for the economic indicators. Yeah. Oh, that's just to reinforce the same idea. In this case, we are talking about wage gaps. So on the right side, we have unadjusted data, which is another way to define descriptive data. So if we consider descriptive or unadjusted data, we can say that, for instance, in Toronto, the wage gap between immigrants and Canadian-borns is around $19,000. But then again, when we consider adjusted data, so when we control for sociodemographic variables, we can see that that wage gap is much smaller. It's around $6,000. But then again, using those controls gives us a much better, much precise understanding of those gaps. Oh, okay, so actually this is the actual statistical model that we use for our CIMII index. So for each outcome, for each indicator, we have this specific regression equation. Actually, in this regression equation, there are three main variables. The first one is immigration status, so whether you are an immigrant or a Canadian-born. Geography, so it can be either a province or a CMA. And finally, we have the controls, so the socio-demographic controls that I showed you before. And finally, we have the interaction term between immigrant status and geography. And actually, this is the most important variable because actually the rankings of the CIMII are based on the standardized coefficient of this interaction term. For instance, let's say that we are considering wage gaps. We can, we can think of the interaction term when it comes to wages, for instance, and like the difference between the wage gap, the difference between immigrants and the Canadian-born population in Quebec, when controlling for the same difference in wages between immigrants and the Canadian-born population in the rest of Canada, and when also controlling at the same time for all the other socio-demographic controls. So again, so let's say that we consider wages, the interaction term will give us an idea of the difference in wages between immigrants and Canadian-borns in Quebec when controlling for the same difference in the rest of Canada and when controlling for all the other socio-demographic controls. And we repeat the same process, the same statistical analysis for all the other indicators. Yeah. Oh, okay. So actually, before I told you that for the rankings, the dimension, for the 4 dimensions, we take the simple average of the different indicators. But actually, we are thinking of moving away from that methodology. And we are thinking about using a weighting system also when it comes to the rankings for each dimension. And so one way to do it, in this case, we use a statistical analysis, which is called structural equation modeling. And so this analysis basically gives you an idea of the importance of different indicator. In this case, we are considering social dimension. So there we have the social integration, which is the main variable. And by using this statistical analysis, we can get an idea of all the importance of all the indicators of the social dimension by using something called the factor loadings. So those factor loadings, are from 0 to 1, and the closer to 1, the better those factor loadings, those indicators represent the main variable. In this case, social integration. So, for instance, for the social dimension, we have 6 indicators. You can see that 5 of them are all positive. They all have a positive association with the social integration. One of them, as we expected, has a negative association with social integration, which is discrimination in the last 5 years. But we also have to look at the factor loading. So you can, from this slide, you can see that, for instance, sense of belonging to local community, a sense of belonging to province have the largest factor loadings. So that means that those 2 indicators are the indicators that better represent, describe social integration. So by using this technique, we can probably assign different weights to the different indicators that belong to the social dimension. And so actually we did this analysis for all the 4 dimensions of the CIMII. And so probably this is the direction we want to take in the future, assigning different weights to different indicators. Yeah, Paul, you can continue.
All right, thanks, Michele. I promise that'll probably be the most technical part of the presentation. We just wanted to give you an overview of the actual methods to show you how we create this index, the statistical index called the CIMII. But I want to talk a little bit about why do we need an integration index? What's unique about it? Why is it necessary? Well, we really look at it as a practical tool for settlement service providers, government policymakers, researchers, and academics, and also the Canadian public has utility for them as well. And how we can break that down, what the utility can be for in different areas here, we can see that it provides a comprehensive measurement framework. So integration is multidimensional across those 4 dimensions, as Michele mentioned. It combines multiple indicators into a clear, comparable framework. And what's key here is there's 22 indicators. You might see some other indices out there with hundreds of different indicators, which we don't think that those are as valuable in the sense that there's a lot of redundancies that are brought up. So we wanted to distill it down to the most important indicators, and even maybe 22 is too many. So it does allow users to go beyond single measures such as the employment rate and instead look at more of a holistic view of immigrant outcomes within reason. Also enables evidence-based policy and programming. Policymakers can use the index to identify gaps or regions where, for example, health disparities are largest, or maybe civic participation lags in certain communities. So you can start looking at how do we build programming to improve those outcomes. And by tracking changes over time, it also highlights whether integration policies are effective or where adjustments are needed. So if you look at it from more of a qualitative perspective, look at the CIMII data, the quantitative data, and then look at what kind of integration policies are within a given community or a province, then you can kind of match to see how effective those policies are in changing outcomes for immigrants. Service providers can also use results to tailor programs. So let's say you're focusing on an employment readiness program. You can look in and see what are the key areas across those indicators, not just the key areas, but what are the key groups that maybe are not doing so well. And this can help tailor programs for those specific groups. Also supports regional and cross-group comparisons. So since we use these national data sets, one that makes it more replicable, it also allows for comparisons across provinces, cities, and for specific groups. So we do, as part of the CIMII, we do have an SGBA plus analysis component, so a sex and gender-based analysis component, where we look to see how specific groups of immigrants are faring relative to others and relative to the Canadian-born population. Adjusted rankings also help rule out demographic differences. This is key. A lot of indices that we see, they just kind of take the descriptive data or what the raw rates are, what are the wages on average between immigrants and non-immigrants, and they use that as the indicator, but they don't adjust for those other factors. Making more meaningful comparisons, it gives you the ability to compare apples to apples to some extent, at least. And this can also inform regional strategies, such as how immigrant outcomes might differ in Alberta versus Ontario, or how newcomers fare relative to more established immigrants. Okay. It also enhances public communication and accountability. So what we talk about a lot with the CIMII is that it's very good at kind of pointing out the problems within a community in terms of deficits in terms of integration. So certain communities might not be doing as well as others. And it's a starting point to start a dialogue or communication about why that is. The CIMII doesn't tell you the solution necessarily. It really focuses on what the problems are, and it's up for that dialogue and for the service sector, settlement sector to establish those different programs and policies from a government perspective on how to address those issues. It also strengthens accountability, showing whether investments in integration are yielding results. And over time, it can help shift narratives by providing evidence of both challenges and immigrant contributions. A couple more points here is that it encourages continuous monitoring and learning, especially from a researcher perspective. Since we update the index with each new data set, each new census, it does become a monitoring tool, showing whether outcomes improve or stagnate or worsen. It supports a feedback loop as well. So from data to policy to implementation, reassessing, remeasuring, and adjusting to improve outcomes. So it also aligns with other international best practices, OECD settling indicators is one example. And more broadly, it contributes to these social goals. Again, creating a dialogue about inclusion, equity, and belonging, and how can we improve that for immigrant communities in Canada. It helps demonstrate where Canada is succeeding and where maybe it needs to improve to build a more inclusive society. It also forms the basis of international comparisons. If you look at the CIMII as a whole, we can look at how Canada is faring relative to other countries in terms of migration practices and integration and inclusion practices. Now, how can settlements, let's look at specific groups now. For instance, settlement service providers, how can they leverage the CIMII? The first go-to I always think of for the settlement sector is using the CIMII for local needs assessments and grant applications, which just kind of goes hand in hand. So if you're identifying local integration gaps, maybe income wage gaps, housing, subsidized housing, or we're starting to look at core housing need, employment disparities, you can start building evidence of community needs for funding proposals. So if you can show that in Calgary, immigrants' employment rates are much lower than, say, in Toronto or in Vancouver, then you at least have some kind of justification as to why your project should be funded in terms of building employment strategies or different economic programs for newcomers in the area. You can also target programming to address specific barriers, demonstrate accountability by tracking outcomes over time. So another example is, a newcomer employment center in Winnipeg may use the CIMII data to show that immigrant unemployment is consistently higher than Canadian-born workers in the region. So this evidence could strengthen a grant proposal to target employment bridging programs in the Winnipeg area. And really, we look at the extent to the success of the CIMII is number one, we have to build the CIMII and make the data available. But the second part, and actually the more difficult part, is getting people to use the CIMII and getting people to leverage the CIMII as for their own purposes. So you can also think about program development and service delivery. Using CIMII dashboards pinpoint which immigrant groups experience gaps across economic, social, civic, and health integration measures, and that you can look for specific groups. So it could be different age groups. You can have maybe seniors programs that are developed based on the outcomes of seniors. That being said, we only go up to age 64 currently. The working age population is what we focus on. That is an area that we've actually discussed in the future. Maybe we could do the CIMII for older generations as well. Aligning the programs and services with CIMII identified gaps. So if you find occupational mismatch, one of the things that we've done recently is looked at underemployment, and then also look at, based on what occupation do you have, what's your education levels, what's your wages, and so on. And also looking at health disparities or sense of belonging to your community, civic participation, for example. So you want to align your program development and services with the gaps that are in your community according to the CIMII or other data sources, but we find the CIMII is really good at bringing all those data sources together to create a more holistic picture. And you can also strengthen collaboration across local immigration partnerships or the settlement sector more broadly using common data. So for example, maybe there's a LIP in Halifax that uses the CIMII sense of belonging indicator to show that young immigrant women report lower levels of belonging. Their sense of belonging to the community is much lower than other groups. This is hypotheticals. I don't know if that's actually the case, but you can always look in the CIMII and find out. So this evidence might help partners coordinate a youth mentorship program or expand social activities, social inclusion activities, fairs, cultural activities, and advocate for funding to support newcomer women's leadership initiatives. In other words, it just provides a lot of justification, a lot of data points that can help you to secure funding from either local or federal sources that can address these needs. Researchers and academics can also utilize the CIMII to advance their projects. So accessing rich data sets to study integration trends over time, that's one of the benefits of the CIMII. It's not just a single point in time, but it is a 30+ year time span that we cover. We can also explore intersectional outcomes using the SGBA lens, publish evidence-based studies to inform both academic discourse and practical interventions, or pilot methodological innovations. So like Michele was showing recently with all the indicators and giving them different weights. So factor and dimension weighting, wage simulations, for instance, that's another aspect of our website that we'll probably show you shortly here. So just as an example, you might say to graduate students, use CIMII data sets in their thesis to test theories of segmented integration, which demonstrates how racialized groups face distinct challenges despite similar education levels as the Canadian-born population. How can policymakers, government policymakers, leverage or use the CIMII? They can inform policy development by having comparative data across provinces and CMAs or cities to identify regional disparities. So maybe they can direct the flow of funding for specific areas based on the gaps that are identified in the CIMII. Support evidence-based decision-making for resource allocation policy priorities. Same thing as I mentioned above. Evaluate impacts of existing policies. So that's really looking at what existing policies are there out there within that province or even federally. How can we improve those policies to be more inclusive and help us to monitor these changes over time? So you can think of maybe municipal policymakers in Calgary use CIMII's rankings, city rankings, to benchmark their integration outcomes against other cities, which would help them shape their local immigrant inclusion strategies. Or from a federal level, you might say that federal officials rely on CIMII comparisons of racialized versus non-racialized immigrants to design targeted employment equity policies. Also for the public more broadly, how the CIMII could be used, it could be used to dispel myths and misconceptions with credible data, on employment, civic participation, health outcomes, and so on. To highlight success stories, so identify specific communities, regions where immigrants are thriving. So if they're ranked really high in specific communities across those dimensions, it gives us a pause, and we can look at why is that occurring. Are there specific initiatives? Are there specific programs? Is there more of a grassroots efforts in those communities to make sure that newcomers are thriving? And then maybe use those as exemplary practices that could be replicated in other geographies across Canada. Also can empower communities. Immigrant communities can use CIMII data to validate lived experiences and advocate for inclusion. You can also think about promoting dialogue and understanding, as we mentioned earlier. So making integration outcomes visible to the broader public in an accessible way, and encourages constructive discussion between immigrants and Canadian-born residents on shared goals, and between policymakers and community advocates as well. So a quick summary: CIMII, a shared tool for action for service providers, demonstrating local needs, informing program development, securing resources for researchers, generating insights into current and historic immigration trends or experiences in Canada, and for policymakers, driving equitable policy and practice and informing the decision-making process, and for communities, promoting dialogue and strengthening advocacy for equity-seeking groups with hard evidence. So on that note, that was really just to describe how the CIMII can be used, at least how we see it can be used. Let's go into the actual tool itself, and I'm going to pass this over to Ravindra, who's going to walk you through our website.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here. Just a brief intro. My name is Ravindra. I go by Ravi, and I'm a research manager at ACS Metropolis, working with Paul and Michele. So let me just pull up my screen so I can walk you through the website. Can you all see my screen? I guess, okay. So yeah, this is the website that we've been talking about so far for the past half an hour. Just to briefly tell you, this is the homepage that you land on. We have search profiles for each province or city that you're interested in. We have overall rankings in the rankings section. But today, for the website to walk through sake, I'll just start with the latest data set that we have. So we have just updated the economic data set, economic dimension for the CIMII. So let me just show you a comparison for the provinces to begin with. So on this section of the CIMII, we have the economic dimension. You choose whichever dimension you're interested in. Let's look at full-time employment rate, for example. So we're comparing the group immigrants versus non-immigrants here. For the economic dimension, you can also choose for recent or established immigrants, as we have definitions for those in the website too. And this is the latest time period. So the way we define time periods is we have all this data from StatScan from different years, but for each dimension, we try to create this time period. It's created by our team here based on what data is available within a 5-year time period. For example, for the 2021 census, we're putting it in the 2021 to 2025 time period. So here's how the data looks like for all the provinces. And you can see for this particular indicator, Alberta is actually doing pretty well. It's ranked 3rd among all the provinces when it comes to this particular indicator. Let's just look at another indicator, which might be a little different for that province. for example, wage, it doesn't look that good. So it's ranked 10th among the provinces. So that means the differences or the gap between immigrants and the Canadian-born population in terms of the wage indicator is much worse than compared to other provinces. And here you can also compare how they have trended over the years. So we looked at Alberta in terms of the wages. It has been historically performing less than the other provinces. So in the previous years, it was also ranked 9, 9, 9. So you can see this trend line in our CIMII data too for the different time periods. And we also have a section where you can compare each indicator in table format for all the provinces. And so that was for the provincial comparison. Let me show you another updated data that we did for the CMAs. So we have two sections for now, but eventually in the next year or so, you'll see just one section where we'll have all the CMAs compared in one section. We tried to experiment with a new classification of the CMAs. So previously, we used to classify all the CMAs into one, big or small. It used to be ranked with each other. But what we kind of felt was we're not comparing apples to apples when it comes to population size. So we decided to classify all the bigger cities or the larger cities, population 3,000 and above, into large size CMAs. So in this particular tab, you can see that we are looking at, for Calgary's comparison, we're looking at large size CMAs. And you can see Calgary for, let's compare the economic dimension overall. It is ranked 5th among all the CMAs. But in the same way, if you're interested in a smaller city, you can go to a medium-sized city CMA, and then you could compare those smaller CMAs within that group. So we are trying to take this approach to other dimensions as well. And in the next few months, you'll see that our website will be updated where all the CMAs will be compared with this new classification. So just for instance, I want to show you how the other comparisons look like. Comparing CMAs, this is the older classification where we compare the civic dimension when we look at civic overall. For this, we have the data available for the 2016 to 2020 time period for now. And with the new GSS, we are trying to update this dimension as well. So as I mentioned before, right now we are only looking at the CMAs ranked together. So in the case of the civic dimension, we have about 20 CMAs that we ranked. But again, as I mentioned, we are taking this approach of reclassifying this into 2 or 3 groups, depending on the number of CMAs available. So that was the provincial and CMA comparison. We also have a rank page where we can actually rank the entire dimension and also assign our own weights. So as Michele mentioned in the previous in the presentation, we can assign different weights to the economic, social, civic, and health dimensions, for example. In our standard or default method, we assign 40% to economic, 30% to social, 20 to civic and democratic, and 10 to the health dimension. But again, these are interchangeable. So for example, with this kind of default setting, we see that Alberta is ranked 7th among all the provinces when it comes to the overall rankings. But let's say we put economic at 30. So this is a bit slow, so just bear with me here for a second. And then let's increase the health dimension to 20%. So we have to make sure that the weights add up to 100% for this to work properly. Okay, now, as you see that the colors patterns have changed and the rankings have changed as well. So now we see that Alberta is ranked 3rd in the overall ranking. So what this does is basically, it basically shows that Alberta is actually doing, so this is the CMAs here. They put in the provinces. So if you see the CIMII user rank, that's the rank that when we just change the weights here, you can get the user ranks. So now Alberta has become 3rd instead of 7 when you assign more weight to the health dimension. This is due to the fact that actually Alberta is doing better than other provinces when it comes to the health indicators. So this is one way that the user can interchange these weights, and based on what kind of data that they're looking at, what kind of importance they want to assign to these indicators, they can get these rankings. The search page on this website, we are kind of in the middle of updating it. And the next product that I'm about to show you in a bit is actually an upgraded version of this particular page, where we try to compile or summarize all the information from these rankings, from these descriptive statistics into one document for each city that we are preparing. That will help you summarize all this information in a single document. Some of the other features on this website, we have a section on the CIMII studies where we constantly update our different studies that we are doing for conferences, for papers that we're writing. So for example, we're looking at, we have uploaded 2 studies for now. It was a study on the social inclusion and civic participation among immigrants, where we looked at data from the General Social Survey of 2020, and we were looking at voting outcomes, basically how much are these immigrants? Again, we looked at immigrants who became citizens and how was their participation in different kinds of election. And we also have a different models that you can select. So you can add different controls to your own model and see how these outcomes change, basically. So if you're interested, please go to our website and play with these tools. I think it'll be much more of an exercise if you guys do it on your own. The simulation page, again, this page, we are in terms of upgrading it with the new data set from the 2021 census. This was based on the previous census, so we need to update this as well. So I'm not going to go into detail for this one. Next, we have a lot of documents on the resources section. For each dimension, you can download the data sheets. So far, we haven't uploaded for the new time period, that is the 2021 census and so on, but you can download the documents from the previous time periods in the data sheets section. If you're really interested in learning about more how we work, how we are creating this methodology, we have documents on the methodology, the code book for the indicators that we use from different years, and some other user guide documents in this section. And we also upload our conference presentations from time to time on our website as well. So now let me take you to the new document that I was talking about. So as we knew that this webinar was coming up from Immigrant Services Calgary, we are trying to pilot this new product. We are calling it the CIMII City Profile. So this is for Calgary, where we are summarizing all the CIMII dimensions, all the indicators into one place. So it's easily accessible. And if someone doesn't have time to look into the website and wants everything in one place, I think this document might be a good place to start as well. So we have some introduction about the CIMII on how Calgary ranks in terms of all the major cities for each dimension. We have an overall rank. Calgary ranks 5. And again, these are based on the weights assigned as the standard, which is 40% economic, 30% social, 20% civic, and 10% health. And the second page, we just have a summary of the demographic information for the city in terms of Canadian-born, established immigrant, and recent immigrant. So we define established immigrant, we have it in the later section, but established immigrants are those who arrived in Canada 2016 or earlier based on the 2021 census data, and recent immigrants are those who arrived after 2016. So yeah, this section has the demographic profile for the city. And then we start with the economic dimension. We have a summary of the ranks, the CIMII ranks for all the indicators. And we also have descriptive data added onto it. So you can look at the ranks, you can look at the adjusted ranks when we add all the controls. But if you just want to look at the raw numbers, we also have, based on the 2021 census, what the different indicators look like, just comparing the raw differences between Canadian-born, established immigrant, and recent immigrants for these indicators. And we also have a key takeaways section where you can look at some analysis of these data trends. And we are also comparing them with the Canada as well as the provincial average for each group. Yeah, next page is the social profile. Again, the same thing in a similar layout. We have the ranks and the descriptive data for the social dimension, followed by the civic profile and the health dimension. So what we were thinking is we will disseminate this document along with the resources section or of the CIMII website for anyone who is interested. And yeah, we would love to get some feedback because this is again a pilot product, as we are calling it. We want to do this or replicate for other cities, at least to begin with the 12 major cities. So we would like to improve upon it. If you have any feedback, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to incorporate any kind of comments or suggestions that you might have. I think this is it from the website and this section. Paul, do you want to share the presentation again?
Sure. Thanks, Ravi. And just there was a question in the in the chat box that can we get access to the city profile and to the presentation as well? Yeah, absolutely. After the presentation today, after the meeting today, we'll send it to anybody. We'll send it to the group actually.
Yeah, we'll send it to ICS and they can disseminate it eventually. Yeah. Okay.
Share this again, and we're going to head over to Michele again. Here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the discussion of integration and inclusion as we referred to earlier.
I think just one thing in terms of resources, we also have an e-learning tool. Yeah, there it is. After this, maybe.
There we go.
Yeah. So we have an e-learning course on the UMetropolis e-learning platform where we have details on how the course works, how the CIMII works. And can you go to the next slide, Paul? So we have some lessons or some recorded interviews with subject matter experts that can talk about each dimension in particular. We have experts for the economic, civic, social, and health dimensions, where you can learn more about these indicators and how the CIMII can help you study these indicators or learn about immigrant integration using the CIMII. So yeah, Michele, handing over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. It was very interesting. And so the Canadian Index is for measuring integration and inclusion. And inclusion is something that we decided to add recently. And so just a brief discussion about the difference between integration and inclusion. Overall, probably we could say that integration refers mostly to the process and the outcomes of how immigrants adapt and participate in the host society. So we take in consideration, that's exactly what the CIMII does. We take in consideration the level of participation and the outcomes of integration when it comes to different areas, economic area, the social dimension, civic participation, and health of immigrants. So integration mostly focuses on immigrant outcomes compared to Canadian-borns. Okay, and so in terms of measurement, integration mostly looks at closing these gaps. We always like to talk about relative parity. So that's exactly what those rankings are. They look at the gaps between immigrants and Canadian-born population and the Canadian-born population. So obviously, examples of indicators of integration are employment and unemployment rates, income, housing, when it comes to the economic dimension, friendships across groups, discrimination, sense of belonging for the social dimension, and so on. So here the idea is that integration mostly focuses on the outcomes of immigrant integration and the process and the outcomes of how immigrants adapt to the host society, to the Canadian society, in those different dimensions. Yeah, you can move on, Paul. And so actually, this is the definition, the theoretical definition of integration that the CIMII has adopted. So we consider the integration as a dynamic process. Okay, so it's basically a two-way street. Okay, I believe this is the definition of integration that Barry has provided. So it's two-way adaptation. So immigrants as individuals, try to adjust to the Canadian society, while the Canadian society, through social policies and different policies, try to adjust to the needs of immigrants in Canada. And so again, the idea here is that integration is achieved when immigrants and Canadian-borns experience relative parity, which in terms of the CIMII rankings refer to those gaps. Again, the smaller the gaps, the better the rankings. Inclusion is probably something, yeah, we can move on. Inclusion is probably something broader. So while integration refers to the outcomes of immigrants when it comes to adapting to the host society, probably inclusion refers mostly to the environment, to the social context, so in political context, I would say. So the idea is here is more the extent to which the social and political context, in this case of the Canadian society, allows immigrants to participate, to belong. Okay, and so in this case, inclusion focuses more on systems, institutions of the broader society. So, for instance, examples of inclusion indicators could be immigrants in leadership positions, in media, in politics, anti-discrimination laws, access to services, hiring practices, or, for instance, could be public attitudes, so the level of trust, acceptance of diversity, reports of racism and discriminations. So it's kind of something a little bit different from integration, in a way broader. So you can move on. So the implication for the CIMII, and actually that's the direction that we would like to take in the future. If you adopt this perspective, an inclusion perspective, for the CIMII, it means that considering immigrants as diverse groups, so different groups with different backgrounds, with different experiences, with different needs. So the idea there is assuming that immigrants start from different points, and so they face different challenges. What that means that from a statistical analysis, from a methodological analysis, we have to implement an intersectional approach. So basically analyzing those gaps, not anymore, or not just between immigrants and non-immigrants, but also probably considering different population groups. So analyzing, coming up with indicator outcomes and rankings based on specific population groups. It could be based on age, on sex, or ethnicity, and so on. Yeah, you can move on. And yeah, this slide is just to reinstate those main points. Social inclusion is more about equal access to opportunities and resources. So compared to integration is a broader approach. Another difference is that inclusion is a proactive approach. In this case, here the idea is really focusing on the social and political environment that allows immigrants to belong, to participate in the host society. And when it comes to the measurement of inclusion, probably that one of the differences could be that it requires more qualitative indicators to measure inclusion. So that's the direction that we would like to take in the future for the CIMII. That's all.
Okay, thanks, Michele. So we have one more section here, and then we're going to open up the room to any questions you may have. So we just want to talk about some future directions. We've kind of alluded to them previously, but one of the things we want to do, we do have actually a related project, kind of a spin-off project of the CIMII, which is called the NICHI, the Nunavut Inuit Sustainable Housing Index project, which really takes that dimensional approach and a lot of indicators around core housing need and other related factors, also like cultural participation and so on. So we wanted to try to expand the CIMII to the north. Now, there's always methodological issues with the smaller population sizes, a smaller number of immigrants, that it has to be more of it'd be hard to do it at a community level, but we can at least potentially do it at a territorial level, looking at the 3 territories and matching those CIMII outcomes in those respective areas to see how they fare. So you can think about, if we did from the territorial levels, or maybe the top 3 cities, we could look at Iqaluit, Yellowknife, and Whitehorse. So you can see, the first time I went there, I was actually a little bit maybe naively surprised that there's quite a large and growing immigrant population in the north. So in Iqaluit right now, about 1 in 10 of the population are immigrant, foreign-born. 16% in Yellowknife is immigrant, and Whitehorse is 15%. Now we know immigration numbers are higher down south, but still it's a growing population, and it needs to be, we have to look at outcomes for them as well. Just to give you some ideas of some of the data over the past 3 census periods, for instance, in Iqaluit here, you can see the percentage of immigrant population. That's just a demonstration over the time. You can see how it's been growing. That one bar in that's Iqaluit. So you can see the blue bar is Iqaluit in 2011, about 5%, about 7.5% in 2016, and now over 10% in 2021. The same graph for Yellowknife. In 2011, it was about 12% immigrants, 15% in 16, and about 17% in 2021. And Whitehorse, you can see about 12% a few census periods ago, in 2016, about 13% maybe, and now it's closer to 15% in 2021. And then also, so it'd basically be looking at the same kind of gaps. For instance, if we look at immigrant versus non-immigrant wage gap, you can see that early evidence suggests strong immigrant integration in northern Canadian economies after adjusting for key socio-demographics. Now, it's early evidence, but there's also the nuance that these populations are a lot smaller, so the models don't necessarily behave as well with smaller communities. That's why we've been trying to partition larger CMAs versus medium-sized and smaller CMAs and kind of compare within those areas. Because I wouldn't suggest that necessarily that Whitehorse and Yellowknife and Iqaluit are doing better economically. But if you look at it, again, what we're doing is we're comparing to the Canadian-born population. And in this case, we're comparing to Inuit populations, which tend to do a lot worse in terms of economic outcomes than Canadian-born populations that are in the South. So that's just a little nuance. It's something we have to tease out while we expand this analysis to the north. Not only to the north, but I mentioned earlier that we're looking at lower levels of geography. So, for instance, if you're a service provider in the city of Toronto, and you only have data at the CMA level, but you actually work in Mississauga, and you want data specifically for Mississauga, well, the CIMII won't really help you that much in terms of identifying key needs specifically for your neighborhood or your community within the city of Toronto. In this case. So what we were looking to do is look at different levels of geography, either the LIPS, which I believe that there's over 100 different LIPS across Canada, versus the 41 CMAs. You can also look at other census divisions. So this is something we're also exploring. Realistically, we can only do this with the larger cities because of the population sizes, and it gets smaller and smaller as you get into these specific communities. And that's just another example of the unemployment rate gap between immigrants and non-immigrants in Toronto. I also mentioned we want to look at Francophone immigrant integration. We've started this process already. So you can see that in Quebec, the proportion of immigrants who can conduct a conversation in French only or along with English more than doubled from 1951 to 2021. And outside of Quebec, just over 1 in 20 immigrants could have a conversation in French only, along with English, which is down slightly. So basically, long story short, in Canada, outside Quebec, the number of immigrants with French as their first language, official language spoken, topped the 100,000 mark in 2021. We want to start seeing how these Francophone immigrants are integrating into non-Francophone communities for the most part, or in the East Coast, you might say they're more Francophone, but certainly in the West, it's more sparse in terms of the Francophonie. So-called cultural communities that they can really integrate into. So how well are they faring in terms of economics, in terms of social participation, access to health, and so on, in communities such as Greater Sudbury or St. Pierre Joli in Manitoba, or even in Ottawa. So we want to start looking at those types of outcomes outside of Quebec as well. Just to give you some labor market outcomes for French-speaking immigrants in Canada, just to start that process, just to show you, you can see like labor force participation rates, and we have employment rates and unemployment rates here. Let's just look at unemployment rates. You can see, for instance, in Toronto, recent immigrants have the highest unemployment rate out of all these groups in terms of French-speaking immigrants. Their best outcomes currently looks like in terms of employment and outcomes, it's probably going to be in, Canada overall 6.5. It looks like Montreal, they're doing pretty well, to be expected. Also in Vancouver, not too bad as well. And we're also looking to replicate the CIMII in other countries, or at least work with other jurisdictions, other countries to help them, guide them through the process. And we've already started that. We've tried to work with the United States, with the census files in the United States, with the American Community Survey and so on. Now the issue becomes more methodological in the sense that, they're not measured at the same time. It's not the same practices. The variables themselves aren't the same always. Certain variables like wages and unemployment rates can be similar, but the way they measure or define things might be differently. So it's really bringing together a common data set between these countries that you can measure integration from a North American perspective, or again exporting the CIMII to other areas like the Paris I mentioned earlier is currently adopting the CIMII. There's also I believe it's Colombia. Group in Colombia is trying to replicate the CIMII in their country, and so it has somehow become an international model. It was always intended to be a national model for Canada, but others are seeing how we're doing it and they want to try to replicate the process in their home countries as well. When we talked a little bit about the inclusion practices, a lot of that is quantitative data, but a lot of it is also qualitative data. So we might look to collect information on policies and practices, or even collecting primary survey data from newcomers to Canada from a quantitative perspective to see, more recent data. They were always binded by the census period. So the last census was 2021. Obviously, we're approaching the next census, but we have to wait a few years after that census is completed to finish the process and update the CIMII. So we're looking at how can we update the CIMII on a more regular basis. One way to do it is to look at the labor force survey, which is monthly, as opposed to the census. That only covers the economic dimension, though. Other data sets, the CCHS does come out on an annual basis. However, they don't always cover every geography and they don't always cover every variable. So these are the methodological concerns we have, but maybe we can supplement the CIMII institutional level data with primary survey data from newcomers to Canada. And to that extent, we've actually tried to work with Leger Marketing to build a newcomer panel where we can ask them, go to the field, work with IRCC or settlement partners to find out what are the specific key issues you want to ask immigrants and Canadians about. And then we could use that data as a supplement to the CIMII's institutional level data. Another thing is, I mentioned before that the CIMII is really good at pointing out what the problems are, but not necessarily what the solutions are. So one of the approaches we're looking at this year and next is to identify case studies or specific communities where immigrant integration and inclusion outcomes are relatively successful and document these as best practices, kind of give them like a meta evaluation to see how well they're working and can they be replicated in other areas, in other settings. Also, from a more of a policy standpoint, is to highlight key findings from the CIMII across these different communities, kind of like what we're doing with the city of Calgary profile, but then taking it a step further and saying, what does this all mean? What are some policy recommendations that could be generated from this data for your specific community? So yeah, that's kind of the future that we're looking to do with the CIMII. There's other avenues. There's always little spin-offs, as I mentioned, the study in the north. We're also looking to build a newcomer housing index as well to see how well newcomers are doing in terms of the housing crisis that's happening in Canada right now and how that's relative to other communities, Indigenous communities and other groups in Canada. And just to wrap up here, we are going to be in Saskatoon at the end of October, at the end of this month. Right after your next lunch and learn, so you can still make it. Your lunch and learn is the 28th. This is the 29th and the 30th. But we will be doing like a 2-session formal training of the CIMII. This was just kind of an introduction overview. But for those of you who are actually very interested in using the CIMII and applying the CIMII, we'll be giving more of a formal training at this conference in Saskatoon. And then again in Halifax, which will be the next Metropolis conference, the national one, will be in Halifax in March of next year. So on that note, that's our presentation. Thanks for bearing with us here, and we'll open up the floor for any kind of questions or comments or observations you may have.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul, Ravi, and Michele, for the wonderful presentation. It was very informative. I know some questions have been asked in the chat and they've been, I think, answered. So everyone, now's the time. If you have more questions or you want to have a conversation about the presentation, what has been shared, please go ahead and indicate by raising up your hand. Okay, so perhaps I'll start while others are getting into it. I wondered, I did see when Ravi was sharing the websites on the resource page, The training that you're doing for using the tool,
Mhm.
is there an online version of that on your website? I'm not sure if I caught that.
We do have the e-learning course, which is always being updated. That's the thing with the CIMII is it always needs to be updated. Things get stale pretty quick with each census period. So there is that online tool, but we're also building, we're doing in-person and online webinars in the future just to train, like, this is an overview, but to get people to actually use the CIMII and to navigate through the website as a group and see how you can use it to leverage for your specific programs or practices. But yeah, there are some trainings being developed currently. This is kind of like a more of an introductory level training or workshop. But there is also the CIMII course. So it's an e-learning course. It's asynchronous. So you can do it at your own pace pretty much. And that's something that we do have available right now. There will be others in the future.
Awesome. And it's accessible at a fee or free?
I believe we opened it up initially as a free product. I think there is a small fee for it, but we can always work with organizations to through those details.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I see we have a hand up. Rafi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anania, and thank you so much for the great presentation and the information. It's a great. So I have a question regarding the data. So the main source is the Canadian census. So how often you update that one? And also I'm thinking of let's talk about Calgary. So we have lots of service providers, immigrant service providers. So how CIMII contacts and build a bridge with these service providers as they have data as well. So how we can reflect their data on CIMII website.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, that's something, we want to look at other data sources. So to go back to your first question, the census is the main data set. So that's why we block in every 5-year period. However, we do use the Canadian Community Health Survey, the General Social Survey. Back in the day, we used the Ethnic Diversity Survey. It was done one iteration. So we try to update as we consider 5-year periods, right? The census periods are aligned with. So right now, we're looking at the most available data for the economic dimension as of 2021. I think for the social data, the latest one we have is 2020. Although we do have access to a 2023 survey. We use a social identity survey for the GSS. So the last one they did was in 2020. However, they do have some indicators in the more recent 2023 data, which is more on giving and participation in organizations, as I recall. So we can update certain indicators, but not necessarily all of them. The Canadian Community Health Survey, again, it's done every couple of years or every year. I think they cover all geographies over a course of 2 years. Again, since we have a common set of variables or indicators that we've been measuring over time, not every indicator is in those data sets every year. So sometimes we have to wait until that's available. But the idea is in 5-year blocks, we try to replicate. So every 5-year block, you're going to see a different version of the health data, the social data, civic data, and so on, economic data. The second part of your question, that's a lot more hard to realize in the sense that we would love to include other data sources in there, or at least do specialized studies that can compare, say, your data in Calgary with the CIMII data, and to see, I think it paints a more holistic picture for sure, because we're relying on institutional data where you might have more community level data or data that's tied to the indicators, but maybe adds more information. So there's also, I don't know if every community would want their data on the website. That's the other issue. It's about accessibility and creating uniformity. So that's something I'd love to talk about offline. We've talked with other groups about how to do that, and a lot of it's just about getting access to the data. And if anything, we can help mine the data with you and see how we can make comparisons between our indicators and what you're seeing and kind of make sense of it all. So that's I think that's open for discussion, but we're not currently doing that.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. We had a hand up. I'm not sure if the question has been answered. Lily, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I think Paul sort of answered that. My question was the 2023 census data. It's now available as of like a couple months ago. I know that because I'm a grad student, I'm using that data set, so I had to update some numbers recently. But I'm just wondering when that data would be reflected on your website.
Did you mean the GSS 2023?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, yeah. We looked at it, and as Paul mentioned, we don't have all the indicators, so we have mostly indicators on volunteering, giving, those sort of indicators, and it will only help us with 1 or 2 indicators. So for the social dimension, we are looking at these other indicators as well. So that's what I think we're discussing too. Like, should we update just the 2 indicators and not the entire dimension, or should we like look at other resources or different data sources for a single dimension? That could be an option, but we're still having conversation about it. So hopefully we'll resolve it soon. Paul, you want to add something?
That pretty much sums it up. I think what we'd
Yeah.
like to do is kind of create like maybe like a separate page on the CIMII for new data that's available, and then once the whole data set's becomes available, then we can update the site accordingly. But we've been trying to do that like kind of like one-off studies or something like that,
Yeah.
or just updates to get the most recent data available.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Any more questions?
You know, we're always open to new indicators as well. Like I mentioned earlier, that we want to keep the indicators to a relatively succinct list. That being said, maybe you're seeing through your work, your practices, that this would be a great indicator to measure. Why aren't you capturing this? We're always open to feedback, given the caveat that we'll have to go back in time in essence to replicate, because it does cover a more than 30 years period. So to create those overall rankings, we do need information for every census period. So the data might not be available. It might be available today, but it might not be available 20, 30 years ago. That being said, we can still work with that.
Yeah, I was going to ask the previous person who asked the question about the GSS. What sort of indicators are you looking at from the 2023 GSS? If they can share with us.
Is that me?
Yes, I believe.
So my research topic is on immigrants, recent immigrants, adult immigrants. So this particular population, looking at volunteering and sense of belonging. So
Okay.
yeah.
Do you have sense
so,
of belonging in that data set?
Yes, there is, but I'm looking at it from a psychology perspective. So the way that Canada measures it as a static measurement actually is not the way I'm approaching it, but I'm looking at the volunteering numbers.
Okay. Thank you.